So this created a traditional infrastructure for the Chinese community. However, after World War II in the 1940s, this traditional system became an obstacle to address a changing community. And thus the modern phase of Chinatown's history is really a story of community mobilization to address these needs and to save the neighborhood. And the second part of the book is about how Chinatown mobilized and evolved. Chinatown started the post-war era as a discounted neighborhood and slowly emerged to being among the leading ones in the city. The Second World War led to the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act. The United States' role as a global leader led to a series of reforms of immigration laws leading to the 1965 Hart-Celler Act. At the same time, inspired by upheavals like the Civil Rights Movement and its successor, the Black Power movement, Chinatown's mobilization was based on a primarily post-war American-born generation and a post-1965 immigration flow. And the primary antagonist was urban renewal and development more generally. This contest would take place over the last 70 years of the neighborhood's history, starting with the 1950 Chinese merchants' opposition to the Central Artery. During that interim, there were many key junctures that I go through, but the gist is that the community learned and adapted from each episode. So its activism became more multifaceted and sophisticated. And I would just contrast two examples. In the 1950s and 60s, the Boston Redevelopment Authority demolished Scarlet Square to make way for Government Center. Scarlet Square was the city's red light district, and its destruction spread adult entertainment businesses and sex workers throughout the city. So this, of course, generated growing neighborhood protests. And in the face of this, the BRA decided to solve the problem by limiting adult entertainment to one area in the city. And in 1974, they chose Lower Washington Street next to Chinatown, never considering the latter a family neighborhood. There was little protest from institutions or the community. The best critique, I think, came from in the form of a letter to the editor at the Globe. It said, "I have just been shown an editorial in the September 20 Globe in which Boston's combat zone was discussed. I was amazed that no mention was made of Chinatown, which directly abuts the combat zone. Those fine citizens have to go through that horrible area with its drunks, filth, vomit, prostitutes, and pimps every time they go to the Boston Common and to the department stores. Chinese mothers must drag their children hurriedly through the maze of near pornographic photos plastered all over the place." So thus, in deciding such a consequential policy, the C and the BRA hardly considered Chinatown a neighborhood in the 1970s, 90 years after it was established. The second case occurred about 30 years later. After decades of expansion into Chinatown, Tunney Medical Center partnered with the Boston Redevelopment Authority to site a garage in Chinatown's shrinking residential area. This was next to the elementary school, housing projects, health clinic, and the elderly center. And the Parcel C garage proposal triggered an 18-month campaign in the 1990s. It involved a coalition of community organizations, primarily its grassroots activist groups and neighborhood residents against the medical center, the BRA, Mayor Thomas Menino, and even the community's neighborhood council in a contest that dominated development issues in the city during those 18 months. But indicative of the evolution of Chinatown was how the community responded as a civic force in the city. It employed not only protest politics, but also legal and regulatory strategies, a media campaign, and political lobbying. The community developed an alternative plan for the site and organized a self-funded community referendum on the garage, monitored by the American Friends Service Committee. The Chinese community voted the garage down 1,700 to 40, which of course the city ignored. Chinatown also organized a citywide coalition of neighborhoods who had been fighting the redevelopment authority. Finally, threatening a civil rights lawsuit on the Title VIII and the equal protection statutes, Chinatown eventually defeated the garage. So this campaign made Chinatown a citywide force among the neighborhoods and changed how the BRA and the medical center would deal with development issues in Chinatown going forward. They began holding community meetings and providing translations. Thus, 30 years later, the community was able to move on multiple levels and within diverse arenas, organize citywide and affect institutional procedure and policies. I just want to end by noting that critical to this evolution was the building of citywide ties and relations, beginning with the Mel King campaign for mayor of the city in 1983. Mel King was the first African-American candidate to reach the finals in the city of Boston. And actually this election triggered a kind of a reform period in Boston administrations. So the campaign established Chinatown as a neighborhood in the eyes of other neighborhoods and constituents who were part of Mel King's campaign. And those ties have spread to broad coalitions in winning bilingual ballots and building workers' rights and affordable housing and tenants' rights networks. And today, I would say that the neighborhood's grassroots organizations, social service groups, and community development corporations anchor various citywide networks. Unfortunately, they are built atop a geographic area fragmented by decades of development battles, so that Chinatown's future is somewhat unclear, but I think it has shown through all this time that it deserves its place in the story of the city. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. This is Paul Watanabe, and it's wonderful. This is a great story. This is a great book that you've written, and I remember part of this is based on your dissertation that you wrote, particularly that dealing with the period of response to urban renewal after the World War II. But I remember when at a point at which you're kind of bogged down, as everybody does in writing their dissertation, at one point I told you, I says, just tell the story of what happened there. And I think you did to some extent in your dissertation, but I really do think you fully tell the story in this piece. And you go all the way back to the 19th century and take it up almost up to the current period of time. And I think it's an incredible tour de force. And so it's beautifully written and very, very provocative. And I really congratulate you on doing so. Indeed, in an icebreaker that we had at some meeting I had the other day, people are asked to talk about the #1 book, the most influential book they've read recently. And 2 people actually mentioned your book and talking about it. Myron Cohen, for example, talked about it. And he talked about it not just in terms of Chinatown, but really in telling us something about the history of the city during that long period of time and its struggle with neighborhood redevelopment. And I thought that was an interesting observation. And David Moy also mentioned that it was one of his favorite books, and he mentioned it for a number of reasons, including the fact that he's featured in the book quite often. So that's David Moy for you. The book covers diverse dimensions of policy, politics, community organizing, but it also has a personal aspect of it too. And I want to talk a little about the personal aspect. And that is the question that lingered in my mind throughout all of this. And that is, why is the survival of Chinatown so important to you as a personally, Michael? This is something that is very evident throughout this thing. That's a personal thing about you, why you care about Chinatown, a place you grew up in. And one of the ways I got an insight about this is about 15 years ago, you and I traveled to Utah, actually, with some other people, where to the town, or the town, I should say, where I grew up. And it's called Beam Canyon, Utah. And I should say it's a place that no longer exists. And you and I went and visited that place. And I was struck by the way in which you really were touched, I think, by that visit. And you might want to say something about that, and I can tell you what I think the connection was. Do you remember that visit?
Yeah, I remember it was, I think it was a Kennecott copper mining area. And I remember there was a, I think your town was on, what was it, the rim of the
copper mine.
The copper mine, which just was a huge open pit. And I guess as the pit widened further and further, it eventually your town had to be moved. So, like, in a sense, your history, your parents and your family was kind of erased. And I think you also told me that the only record I know of that town was that you told of I guess it was in Sports Illustrated, about the baseball team that the Japanese American kids played in. So yeah, so I thought that was really very sad, because I think, as we can see today, in general, the history of Asian Americans is erased in society, and to have physical erased was kind of even more moving.
And it's important to you that this place that you grew up in, even though you moved away not that far, even to Brookline, a couple cities away, or when you went to college in Pennsylvania or so forth, I think it's important to you to know that this place always existed as an anchor for you, right?
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways, even though I did live in many places, well, actually not that many places compared to other people, but when I did live, I was never quite, as comfortable as being in Chinatown. But I think the other thing was that, when I came back and worked in Chinatown, I saw a lot of young people who, maybe for idealistic purposes, forwent like, more lucrative careers to work in Chinatown. I saw ordinary people who, who, as the saying goes, ate bitterness during their lives, and others who, took risks with their jobs and their family to try to preserve Chinatown, and many other people who volunteered their time to keep Chinatown going. So, I just really felt, and I haven't been witness to a lot of the events that I write about, I just felt like their stories need to be told, because, again, who wants to be erased? And I think that Chinatown did have an impact on a lot of things that happen in the city.
That notion of erasure and invisibility is really at the heart of your tome, and as well as the discussion that's going place right now about Asian American history in the United States today. That is the extent to which, despite all this long history and experience of the Asian American community, we're largely invisible. And you have, and you described something in your book, and you did in your dissertation, that I've always impressed me, and sort of gave the point about the invisibility and its dangers. You talk about how Stephen Coyle, the head of the BRA, when a bunch of community activists who were trying to get Stephen Coyle and people in the BRA to understand the impact of unfettered development on people's lives in Chinatown, that it impacted people who were living there. And you gave this story about how they took him around. There was a kid riding a big wheel in the parking lot. Maybe you ought to give that story, because I think it's a critical one.
Yes, the story was told to me by Carol Lee. I guess she, I think Marilyn Lee Tom and maybe Suzanne Lee had hit upon this idea about inviting Stephen Coyle, who was a brilliant director of the Boston Redevelopment Authority, but who had grown up in Waltham, to come visit Chinatown because, I think initially the BRA, even though he was part of the, kind of the reform administration of Ray Flynn, just felt Chinatown should just let development happen. And eventually, we would get some benefits. But then, he came down and he was just shocked to see kids riding around in parking lots because that's the only open space available to kids in Chinatown. And I think it was like beyond his imagination. So actually, after his visit, the BRA changed their priorities and prioritize housing in Chinatown. Unfortunately, by the time he came to this realization, right after that, the economy crashed and all his plans for trying to build a lot of housing. There was a modest amount of housing built, under his initiatives, but not at all what was necessary and what was needed. But yeah.
Yeah, the invisibility just made the point that for a lot of people then and now, frankly, and the powerful and the well-connected, like the Stephen Coyle and politicians, they perceive Chinatown as really just the restaurants and the stores and the storefronts. They never looked on top of and behind that and saw they're real people that lived in there. They called it a neighborhood and it was a residence. Actually, it has the 10 times the density of the rest of the city in terms of residential. It's a neighborhood. And so the notion that that kid was playing in the parking lot really struck him. He says, what's that kid doing here? And they said, well, he lives there. And he never connected the notion that kids actually live there. So if you, of course, bring in somebody and impose a combat zone, it may be impacting people who run businesses, but it's not affecting people's lives. Or if you bring in if you build a highway through the middle of it, it's sort of maybe means that some private property may be taken away, but not people's lives. And I think that distinction is critical both then and now as sort of a lesson about Asian Americans, that there are lives involved here and their invisibility has to be made more visible, that people are really behind all of this experience. Let me ask another question and then I'm going to open it up to other people as well. You talk about a lot of epic battles in your discussion between various community organizations and so forth, and you haven't gone on to them very much in your little summary here, and I can understand perhaps why. But there are a lot of forces at play here, pro-development forces who might be called accommodationists and activists. And here's my question. In some ways, I think, is it a matter of inadequate capability or is it complicity in certain ways about these various forces that have resisted change in Chinatown? I think, for example, about the period after World War II, when, as you indicate, there was very little going on within Chinatown, both in terms of attention by the government and so forth. Maybe it was important that these old time organizations were there just to keep the thing going, the city, the community going to some respect. They weren't into making big changes and they had ended up being somewhat accommodationist in terms of the pro-development thing. But maybe they played a role in a particular time, sort of just keeping the community as a community. I don't know, is that a little too generous in terms of that response?
Well, I have to say, like, no, I think writing a book, I became more sympathetic to, to the leadership in the sense that I kind of understood more deeply, kind of the environment that they faced. And so, they developed a strategy, of, for want of a better term, accommodating the status quo, but that worked for them, for a while. The problem was that, the community was changing. And so the negative side of it was that even though that strategy had worked, they didn't want to adapt and they resisted other people and new other generations participate, being part of the decision making. So they resisted change. So they held things back, and things were no longer, as they say, the center would not hold. So things, things had to change. So on the one hand, I understand why they had that strategy. On the other hand, they were stubborn. I feel they were stubborn and not in resisting change. So yeah, it's a two-sided thing, I think.
Let me just ask one more question along those lines, which is, clearly the situation in terms of the power structure has changed a bit, both in terms of the relative power of the various community organizations that you talk about. That is to say, I think organizations like CPA, for example, and even individuals who you mentioned as very strong activists early on, like Suzanne Lee and so forth, they're very much part of the structure that the city and government officials really go to now in a way which they did not, they were on the opposition on the outside before. And that means a change amongst them, but it also means a change within the attitude of government itself toward these organizations. Can you speak a little bit about that? Part of it is a change within the community, but part of it's in terms of the response of government to these community organizations.
Well, I think that on the part of government, I sympathize with. I think that Chinatown is a situation that they're not used to dealing with, in the sense that there are so many organizations in such a small area. And, of course, the easiest thing to do is to deal with one or two, which they did in the past. And so now, the reality is that things are more decentralized, and they need to speak to all these different groups, which is basically, what they've done. But I think that I think it's problematic that Chinatown hasn't been able to unite more and present a more consensus view. I think there was an opportunity maybe with the first neighborhood council, where all the different groups are, sides are represented. But anyway, so I think it's a more decentralized situation. But I think that and then the influence that people have in government is, I think it's a positive thing. But I think that the thing I think that shouldn't be forgotten, that to me, like, policy is the handmaiden to politics. And what's moving Chinatown is more the fact that the community has been able to mobilize. And the more you're able to mobilize, the greater the range of policies that you have. I mean, we've been talking, like, education, affordable housing has been talked about in this city for decades and not solved. In fact, things have gotten worse, and so there has to be a better range of policies in order to really solve the problems that the city needs. At least, maybe this current crop of mayoral candidates, that people will start looking at more serious and more structural changes to how do you provide basic needs like housing and health and education. So that even though people have gained more influence, I hope that they will also keep in mind the larger goal of what we're trying to do.
Okay, Michael, I'm going to turn to some of the questions in the Q&A section. And one of them, the first one is, what were the most surprising findings in your research? Or did you see any things that surprised you in your research?
Well, I think the whole process of I don't know if one thing was that Chinatown had a very colorful history, for one thing. I found things about Amelia Earhart, possibly Ho Chi Minh. I found out things like Deal used to be this queen of Chinatown, which was a white woman who was, but she could interact with people outside Chinatown. So the residents, primarily men at that time, valued her role. And then just being able to tell the story, I was, just be able to recount, and I think we all know different aspects of it and put it all together, how lengthy and protracted and determined the community was in carrying out this battle, because it's just been such a long time. So that to me was the most surprising thing, is that the community was able to do it. I haven't been able to really find actually other Chinatowns, except possibly if you read the book, with the exception of Philadelphia, that have conducted the same protracted struggle.
Okay, I have a note that Brianna from Chisney may want to give you some perspective on the answer to this question. So Brianna, are you available?
Yes, sorry. In terms of interesting things that I found, like in our archives or just in general?
Well, it says, Brianna, my note is that you'd like to answer, give some thoughts about this question, about what he found is interesting and surprised him in his research. I know.
So that's just me marking that we're answering it live, but that's okay.
Okay, sorry, thank you.
You're fine.
Michael, some people want to know how to get younger people involved throughout in the Chinatown struggle and interested in it. And this is an aspect that, again, I urge people to read the entire book, because if there's one thing that Michael Liu is well known for, it's about caring about seeing that there are future Michael Lius, that he's not the last of a dying generation, but he's the first of those who want to really see this continue forward. So Michael, you can talk a lot about the things that you've done or did throughout this struggle and what you see about the future, getting younger people involved in the fate of Chinatown and other issues.
Well, I don't think that this is, well, I think that there are a lot of young people that are, interested in working in Chinatown. I think that, this whole pandemic, actually this preceded the pandemic, but the violence against Asians has actually activated and opened the eyes of a lot of people, especially young people. And I think they've been among the most active organizers of protests against, the racist violence against Asians. So I think a lot of people are interested, in working in Chinatown, and I've actually seen quite a few, but a lot of them you see in the arts. I think it's a lot of activity around the BCNC's Powell Art Center, because people seem to be more arts oriented nowadays. Not my specialty, but there's also, people around ACDC, there's people that I know of, and there's people around BCNC and CPA. And so I think there's quite a number of young people. I don't know about some of these, other groups, more social service groups, whether or not young people coming around. But I think young people are interested. I think it's our role to kind of, but I think young people are different. I mean, I don't understand completely their perspective. The whole thing about sexual expression, and I mean, I don't understand it. But I empathize with it. And so, so we have to, I think, accommodate ourselves to them. I think Chinatown needs to, and I think there actually was I remember a period when it was actually difficult for young people to come into Chinatown who were not from Chinatown. The suburbs, just like, you're not a local, so, all you want to do is come write a paper or something like that. And so, but eventually people change. So I think that we have to kind of be more open and be more welcoming to young people.
You talk a lot about the impact of the Chinatown Boston story on other Chinatowns experience across the nation, and about how other communities of color are trying to maintain their identity and their sense of place within the city. One thing you say a little bit less about, and I'd be really interested in, is there are so-called new Chinatowns, like in Malden and Quincy, for example. Is there something from this experience that can help people think about how they see their place in the future? Those, I'm calling them new Chinatowns for lack of a better term. But is there something for them in this story as well in terms of how they perceive their role in these new places that are beyond the urban core?
Well, that's a that's a good question, Paul. I didn't write it with them in mind, but I think that that what Chinatown has gained, and the fact that it has this, I think, a place in the city now, has really come from its own efforts, its attempt to mobilize its population. So I think that's the main thing. I think that these other Chinatowns, I mean, these other Chinese communities need to take into account. It's not, so I think, there's a spectrum between, keeping your head down and kind of, mobilizing, and it's a spectrum thing. And I think from what I've seen, most of the work has been more toward keeping your head down. And I think people should consider, that the only way you gain respect is by being able to mobilize your own community. But good work with APIs can, Paul, and helping the Malden people, actually the Quincy people too, become more active.
Well, I want to give a little bit of answer to my question, which is really part of your response, which is this. I think you see Chinatown, the connection to it, less in terms of physical space only. For example, the Chinatowns in Washington, which have the gates and all the paraphernalia, they're not really a Chinatown. A Chinatown is something that people can call a home, right? A people where they can call a neighborhood. They can feel comfortable living as Chinese people within it and call it a place that they consider not exclusively theirs, but a part of theirs is really there. And that can be found in Quincy, and that can be found in Malden. It doesn't have to be found in a place with all the gates and all that sort of paraphernalia. And I think in that respect, I think you could see a possibility where people in the Maldens or the Quincy's or so forth can see themselves as really being a part of a community, a visible part of a community, unashamedly a visible part of that community. And in fact, not have to have a history, a long history as the Boston Chinatown has. In fact, it could be a recent history that one builds upon, I think.
Yeah, and I think they are right now in a better position to assert themselves. I mean, we actually, I meet a lot actually young people from Quincy, who want to do more, but I think that it's difficult to do it in Quincy and Malden, and they actually come to Chinatown because it has more of this history of being active. But they should do it. People should do more in their home communities.
I think, for example, in Boston, it took about 150 years for an Asian American woman to be president of the city council. In Quincy, it took about 8 years, within her first term, a little over her first term, for Nina Liang to be an Asian American woman at the head of their city council. So things can move much more quickly in these other domains. And I think they can learn from the Boston story about this perseverance and the importance of creating that sort of identity. The inevitable question that people ask, what do you think of the future of Chinatown 20 years from now?
Well, I think Chinatown will still be here. I think clearly the business area is not, I think the businesses will clearly be here. Obviously the pandemic has hurt it, but I think a lot of them have come through this last period. And more worried about is the residential area, but it seems like there's been enough low housing projects that have been stabilized that there will still be a residential population. But really, I mean, why, how you open a book is like trying to take a walk from business area of Chinatown to the residential area. And, it's really a fragmented, broken up area. And so, so that's why I wonder, and you can even just stand in the middle and look south and look north, and you see, these looming towers. So I feel like, and people, I mean, other people know that these different proposals for hotels and other developments, in Chinatown. And so it's a real question about what it will look like. So I don't have a clear answer, and I really have concerns. And obviously, Chinatown is no longer the family community that I grew up in, and people like Stephanie grew up in, and so it's really become a place for older people and kind of Chinese speaking recent immigrants to get their their feet right in the United States. And so yeah, how it will all work out. I think people are trying really hard. The master plan committee is and other groups are trying to fashion a vibrant community. But I feel development, that's the thing I keep on saying, development is the core thing in cities. That's where that's where the money is, that's what drives everything. And development doesn't care very much about Chinatown. And so yeah, so I'm unsure.
Specifically on the question, you talked about how Chinatown had been divided, and partially it was because of the highway construction. And under the Biden transportation bill that's being put forth by the Democrats right now, there is, I think, $30 billion being set aside for the specific purpose of helping communities reunite that were divided by highway construction. It seems like Boston Chinatown is a perfect place for this money to reside. Do you know about this? Do you know whether efforts are underway to try to promote this legislation?
No, Paul, I think you know more about it than I do. I mean,
Oh,
but
boy.
yeah, I mean, that's great that there is. I mean, urban renewal, some of you know that urban renewal, like the African Americans used to call it Negro removal. And it was not just Chinatown, it's all the marginal, least powerful communities that are targeted by highways. So if they're gonna provide some money to kind of make some of these communities whole, more power to them. But you don't see evidence that they're talking about this big project on Nealon Street where the I-93 empties into the city, and I don't see that any proposals to use that money and to make some gains for the community. So
Well, you have a great aerial view of Chinatown. You show how the Mass Pike extension runs right through the Chinatown, divides it between its part, which is closer to the Washington Street or whatever that, Nealon, I guess it's Nealon Street, and then the other part down by the New York streets. And if you just look at that picture, you can see how the community got physically divided. And this fund of money is specifically to reunite communities that were impacted by highway construction, particularly interstate highway construction, which this one is. And I hope that people here in Chinatown who are working on these issues will really see a place of trying to go after some of this money. It seems ready-made for a situation like Boston Chinatown. Wing Kai To our friend has asked a question, and I'm going to try to give it speak. He's asking you to speak a little bit about Chinatown as both an anchor for new Chinese immigrants and a place for preserving cultural identities for Asian Americans. Are these two goals reinforcing each other, or are there tensions between the immigrant identity and multi-generational Asian American identities?
Well, yes. I mean, obviously there are tensions because it's I think it's their differing identities. I mean, obviously, I mean, because the young people, the you know, tend, well, people know, like, you know, there's always this long-standing tension between what some people call, you know, fresh off the boats and the American born, and and you know, obviously, the American born tend to see themselves more as Asian American. A larger percentage of them do, and obviously the immigrants see themselves not sometimes simply as Chinese, but also the region of China that they come from. So you know, I think there are tensions, but I think that what happens, and this is the whole thing about Asian America too, is like, on the one hand, you have all these differences. On the other hand, society as a whole and your experience and how society treats you kind of drives you together, because, you know, as you can see with the recent the racist violence against Asians, you know, Filipinos, Koreans, Vietnamese, they all, like, you know, being called chinks and being beaten up. And so these two opposing forces, one, you know, bring people together, and others, you know, but I think, like, attitudes and points of view, you know, that people come with that are different. And so I think how things work out, you know, we have to see. And I think that, but efforts such as, you know, Paul, what you're doing with APIs can, and, you know, and I think we're lucky, like in Boston, for example, like the Vietnamese and the Chinese community kind of work together. Whereas I think in larger Asian American enclaves, like in California, sometimes you have, like, candidates running against each other, and there's, like, more competition. So again, this is something that we should work on in terms of kind of bringing people together. And you know, people need to learn about our history in this country. People need to learn about the lives of you know, other communities, other Asian ethnicities, you know, and to see, you know, our commonalities, so that we can work together. And that's better than, obviously, than fighting with each other. But, you know, it's a tough job, but, you know, I think that's something that we have to do. But that's the beauty and the difficulty in this country, you know.
I have another question, which I don't think you get into in any degree, and it may not be relevant, but the question is, how do the politics in China affect these dynamics in Chinatown and Boston? Clearly, historically, at various different periods of time, they've had a big impact, and other times they haven't. But do you want to comment on that question?
Yeah, I'm not really yeah, I'm not really in a position to comment on that question, because, you know, I don't, from what I can see, you know, obviously there was a big division before, but now people have a lot of economic interests, particularly in, you know, in China, and so that's kind of smoothed over some things. And so, but, you know, there are obviously still differences. You can see the competing Republic of China and People's Republic of China flags. And so during October. But I don't know, but I do want to say, though, you know, this kind of increasing view about China being the primary threat to the United States and the Western world, that Biden has continued, you know, from Trump, is quite worrying. And I think it's and its effect on how people will view the Asian American population, particularly Chinese population, is worrisome. And I think that, you the attacks that people have seen may continue because of the, these tensions.
Someone asked, do you see any hopeful signs in the fact that we do have now some Asian Americans who have served in the Boston City Council, beginning with Sam Yoon a few years ago and with Michelle and so forth recently, that we have not only Asian Americans, but people of color, and particularly women running for high office. We have an Asian American representation at the State House that we, in a few short years, has moved from 0 to now, I think, 7 or 8 Asian Americans now in the State House. What do you think is behind this? Is this like still too little and too late, or is it significant, or why do you think this is occurring?
Well, I think, it's just occurring because of demographics. I mean, the population is growing. I think, when I was working for you, Paul, I think, you can see like around like when the population in a town or city reached 5-10%, then you see people begin to run for office. And so I think, as the population has grown, there's been more representatives. It's obviously a good thing, obviously you can talk to, Tacky probably, more honestly than you could talk to, I don't know, Joe Schmo from Amherst or something like that. And I think it's a good thing, but, I'm more impressed that, where Asian American candidates like, Michelle Wu, thinks outside the box, propose things, like, free tea ride, maybe rent control, that sort of thing. Not that I don't know about the specific policies, but at least, people are proposing things that try to, solve basic problems that and people's needs. So, I'm more feel hopeful about that, that they have, progressive thinking, outside the box thinking, than the fact that solely the number of representatives in office.
Another person asked the question, if you can comment on how Asian and African-American communities have assisted and worked with each other on various issues within the city. And you talk about this fairly extensively, talking about the Rainbow Coalition and working together with Mel King, and then right up to the recent activity, the creation of the right to the city and so forth. But you want to comment a little bit about that element?
Yeah, I've said before, like, at least in my active life, I think being part of participating in the Mel King campaign gave me the most optimistic view I've had of the city, because for those of you who didn't work in the campaign, it was organized along the lines of, at least initially, of constituency groups and neighborhoods like Jamaica Plain, LGBTQ, women's groups, Latinos, the Fenway. And so everybody, we had a, an Asian group, and everybody kind of like, work together, and I felt that we were treated and kind of accepted as part of the city. And so that's what the optimism I got from that campaign. And there's been, and I would say, and there's been numerous attempts to work together, as well as, points of conflict, but there was an attempt to replace the elevated orange line, the old orange line, with a real streetcar line, that actually became the silver line. That went on for many years. There was a lot of support from the African-American community around the Long Guang Wang case, which is a police brutality case in Chinatown. And because African-Americans were very familiar with the role of police in the area, that, Mel King, Chuck Turner, and other people came out in support of the Chinese community. And, so that's continued. But I think, though, that, so I think that's continued and around, and people are now working, I think, to more formal, more formal structures like right to the city. And, some of us participate in other formations to try to revive the Rainbow Coalition idea, like the new majority effort that happened. So yeah, I think there's a long history that probably younger people or maybe others also may not know about, where we have tried to work together.
Great. I just encouraging anybody else, if you have a question, you got to do it in the question and answer section ideally, or in the chat, where Biana is monitoring the questions and send them over to me. So if you have any questions, please do let it be known in the question and answer section of this piece. I'm going to talk about one area that I think there's a bit of an omission, and you can tell me whether I'm wrong about this, and that is the role of educational establishments within the city. And I really think of two players in this: Tufts New England, Tufts, the other Tufts, not the Tufts New England, the Tufts University and its ability to really train some students largely under Gene Wu's leadership. And frankly, UMass Boston, I think, has played a critical role in this development. There's not much said about this. Do you think, am I right, that there's a bit of an omission in terms of their role within this discussion?
Yes. Yes.
I mean, Tufts New England takes a hell of a beating, and it should, but Tufts University does not, and does not sort of get some praise that I think is forthcoming to it as well.
Well, yeah. Well, I think, yeah, Tufts University has a kind of, I don't know, a mixed record. I think actually Gene was, I think Gene was responsible for interesting a lot of students in community issues, but I think she wasn't that well treated by university.
Yeah, I think she's going to write her own book called Forever Struggle for Asian American Studies at Tufts. It still continues. I know it does.
But yeah, but overall, I would say, and then UMass Boston obviously has been very important, particularly in the Fields Corner Vietnamese community area. But I think and I think that as we've become more sophisticated, that we see like this a real benefit in the community and the universities working together. I mean, but of course, back in the day, I think Paul, when you and I got started, the idea was that, I mean, people from the university, primarily students, would come bring resources from the university into the community. But now that this isn't quite the same drivers, and I think we had to kind of like do more mutual outreach to build that. But I think that they could help a lot, and I think that you see more and more interaction of that. I think that there's been a lot of groups that have been helping with Chinatown planning, from Harvard to MIT to as well as Tufts, and UMass Boston, as well as projects in the Dorchester area that I'm not familiar with. But anyway, I think that that's something that we should really pursue. And then the university can put it down as one of their pilot contributions.
Well, another question is asked here, and you've touched upon a little bit. They ask, what is the biggest unanswered challenge for Chinatown today? Is it housing? Is it what might it be?
Yeah, I would have to say it's housing. I mean, but it's true for the whole city the city as a whole. How are we going to solve it? I don't know. I look at Singapore. The government plays a major role in providing housing, or you look at social housing in Europe. But we're far from that. So, I mean, there was a Paul, there was a time when the government played a role in providing housing. I mean, the federal government. So. I think people have varied assessments of how successful the effort is, but at least they took the responsibility.
Well, the next question asks about housing in some respects, which says, what is the future gentrification, presuming not only for Chinatown, but other areas like Fields Corner and other parts of the city? Again, I think you've touched upon it, but the future looks troubling if gentrification trends continue, correct?
Yeah. I mean, I think the city, the city has to decide, like, do these communities, even though, do they help, are they a benefit of the city or not? Are they obstacle to development? And I talk in the book about how in some cities they kind of manufacture these these Chinatowns, basically commercial ventures, right? Las Vegas and places like Austin and and so so I think that there is a benefit. And you don't want, every place to look like, I don't know, Back Bay throughout the whole city. I mean, how interesting would that be, So, yeah, and I think that's the question. I kind of cite the study that was done in the 70s from MIT and Harvard about, is there a place for ethnic communities, special communities, like Chinatown in the city, and obviously I think it is, obviously you have situations in some areas where are totally gentrified, where people can't, the people that actually work there, in these like high tone tourist areas where people who actually work there can't live there, places in Colorado or the Cape to a certain extent, it's crazy.
But is it less charitable to say, however, that the maintenance of these communities is critical, but if they're the same thing that they were in the 1880s, that is poor communities at the bottom of the heap economically, have we really advanced them as communities in a significant degree? They are, Chinatown today exists as one of the poorest communities in the city of Boston as it was in the 1880s. Is that our measure of success, that we're able to maintain it as a community and yet it continues to be at the bottom of the heap or face these economic difficulties? Or is there got to be a greater measure of success than that?
Well, I think, whether or not Chinatown remains a poor community is more a function of how society is, whether or not they are poor people in your society. We know, like, American society is getting more and more unequal, and so but I'm not arguing. I mean, I'm not saying that Chinatown needs to be the same, but well, there needs to be a place for lower income residents somewhere. But what I was arguing that is that Chinatown has changed and adapted in order to survive, and whether or not so, and whether or not that role includes being a place that poor people finds a place. I think, if it's a useful role, I think Chinatown should play. I mean, not everybody comes from China as with a PhD, and so there has to be a place for them. So, is it progress? It plays a useful social role, even if that's the situation. But I'm not saying that it should. Chinatown has changed, and it should change to meet the needs of the population, as long as we're still discriminated against, ignored, and have fewer opportunities than other people. I think it still has a useful role as a refuge and a platform to accomplish different social purposes.
Mhm. Okay, I'm going to see if there are any other questions. Somebody asked a question about the role of CCBA anymore within the Boston Chinatown. Let me tell you, if you read the book, he goes into great detail and very careful in his discussion about all these groups, including the new ones and the old ones. So I think he has a very interesting discussion about that. I don't know if you want to talk about it. It's a kind of a bald question out of context. I think it might be misinterpreted however you answer, but you can give an answer if you wish.
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously you can't write a history about Chinatown without talking about CCBA. You know,
Yeah.
obviously it hasn't played the same role as it has before, but I would just say that, you know, I hope, you know, I have poor Chinese language abilities. And I don't even know if, you know, there are Chinese records available, but someone needs to, you know, write. I mean, I hope someday someone writes a history of Chinatown that can access, you know, all these, any Chinese language records. You know, I know Gordon Chang, who's leading the effort of documenting the Chinese railroad workers, have not been able to find one document about the Chinese, you know, from a Chinese railroad worker. And so I hope that that there are documents in these associations that it's useful for the history of Chinatown. And I hope someone writes one, and it would add to you know, a fuller picture of Chinatown. So I talk about CCBA, but I don't pretend to have a full history about, you know, all the comings and goings and how it's changed exactly.
Well, since you are in the business of naming names within your book, let me talk about ask you to talk about some of the people who have inspired you, some of your heroes that emerge within this book, and I think there are many of them. You want to give some props to some of the people that you talk about in this book? Without understanding, you're going to leave certain people off and all that sort of stuff, but maybe as examples of the kinds of people who you know have been active, because I think it's pretty amazing the kind of people have been brought together in this struggle.
I think, you know, I think people, you know who they are. They have all worked. I feel like, you know, even if I don't agree with them, you know, completely, like Richard Chin, you know, you know, Stephanie has done so much for Chinatown, and Caroline Chang. But, you know, the book, you know, focuses a lot on the activism, and therefore there's a lot of focus on, you know, Lydia Lowe, who led CPA for a long time, you know, and Suzanne, obviously, in an earlier part, Suzanne Lee, in the early part of CPA's history. So yeah, I think that, as I mentioned, but, you know, in a way, like, the real movers and shakers are, you know, some of these Chinese speaking. I mean, you know, kind of what opened the door was the Chinese Parents Association, you know,
Yes.
around Boston busing. And
Absolutely.
even though, you know, Suzanne was a major facilitator, you know, a way, what drove it was the parents themselves. They're the ones that came up with the idea about the, you know, organizing a student boycott. And they're the ones that put it together, because Suzanne was off on her honeymoon. So when they start to implement the plan. So, and so they, you know, and I should also mention that in particular women in Chinatown, you know, have been the driving force at these kind of, you know, immigrant, you know, primarily Chinese speaking working women. And so I think, you know, I'm inspired a lot by them. Also, you know, and today you can see around, you know, home health workers, you know, they're first to unionize with a largely Chinese speaking home health aides. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you make that point. Political scientists like me often focus on what we call the impact of communities on regular politics, voting and elections. And here's a great example of a community that for a lot of reasons, largely because of status, are not people who are voters. Many of them are immigrants and are not citizens, so forth, that yet by other means, through mobilization, to showing up for rallies, to protests and so forth, had at times had a big impact on public policy and lots of decisions that were made. And I think it's a great lesson in that regard, that you can have politics outside of so-called normal politics, at protests and so forth. You don't have to be a citizen to show up at a meeting. You don't have to be even somebody who's an English language speaker if you have the infrastructure in place to make their views be known. And I think it's a great example of how you can have an impact, that politics is not defined by the ability to vote solely. It's defined by all these other mechanisms, of which non-citizens are really the ones to teach the rest of us about the value of those sorts of things. I think it's a great example. There's example after example of this throughout your book. Okay, well, I'm going to check once more, see if there are any questions. And then finally, I'm going to let Michael have the last word here in a minute. But okay, I think I've got most of your questions. So Michael, my big question is, well, what's next? What do you want to write about? What's the big story to tell?
No, actually, Paul, I think you need to write another book.
Yeah, right.
You've had a lot of experiences, but well, actually, I was talking to I just had the exchange with Yahoo Miller. I said, this is consistent. Yahoo Miller is the editor reporter for the Banner. I said, Mel wrote a history of the African American community, but it was written a long time ago. It really needs to be updated, and that he needs to write it. In the same way, I hope Lorna or Miriam Uriarte writes from the Latinx community, because there is nothing out there. So that's very important. So, but I want to thank the Chinese Historical Society for holding this event. I think it does very important work. I hope the organization grows and we're able to put together a larger space and have the materials more available, for people to see the history of not only Chinatown, but the whole community. Because I think it's a contribution to the area.
Well, thank you, Michael. Because of you, we now have at least a definitive account of Chinatown, at least so far. And I think it's really an amazing piece of work, really well done. And maybe I will write the definitive account of Bingham Canyon, Utah, the town that no longer exists because of the
no,
destroyed the town I grew up in. It doesn't exist anymore. If so, I could make, there'll be a few people who'd be interested in that. But thank you very much, Michael. Really appreciate it.
You can write about the Asians as you did for the Greeks.
There you go. Yes, if I can be, yes, that's right. Thank you very much.
Okay, so on behalf of Chesney, I would like to thank Dr. Michael Liu and also Professor Watanabe for moderating this wonderful panel this afternoon. I mean, it is certainly also, not without mentioning, it is Juneteenth today, so I am really glad that we did touch on some of the collaboration between the African-American communities and Chinese communities. And I really want to thank everyone who attend this session this afternoon. We will have the recording. The next Tunney Lee lecture will be in September. I think tentatively we have John Kuo-wei Chen, who's the co-founder of MoCA, confirmed as a speaker. So more to come. I think it's more going to be focused on anti-Asian hate. But thank you very much, and we look forward to interacting with all of you, and definitely check out Michael's book. So thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
All right.
Thanks, Michael.
Have a great afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.